The number on the chalkboard was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself. Not the kind of wrong that sets off alarms or makes engineers reach for the telephone. Just wrong. A quiet, polite, almost invisible wrong. The kind that hides inside a calculation the way a fault line hides inside solid ground. And on the morning of February 20th, 1962, that small difference between what the IBM computer said and what Katherine Johnson's pencil said was the difference between John Glenn coming home and John Glenn never coming home at all. It was 6:45 in the morning at Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. The temperature outside was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself dramatically either. It just settles into your coat and stays there. Inside Building 12, the fluorescent lights had been burning since before sunrise, humming at that particular frequency that after enough years you simply stop hearing. The linoleum floors were the color of old mustard. The metal desks were government-issue gray. Someone had left a paper cup of coffee at the corner of Katherine's workspace sometime around midnight. It sat there still, completely cold, a small monument to the hours that had already passed before most of the country woke up. To understand what was at stake that morning, you have to understand what the word failure would have meant in February of 1962. Project Mercury had consumed 6 years of sustained national effort. $500 million, the intellectual labor of over 18,000 engineers. The mathematicians, machinists, seamstresses, technicians, and support personnel distributed across the United States. The Soviet Union had already placed 2 men in orbit, Yuri Gagarin in April of 1961, German Titov 4 months after that. America had responded with 2 suborbital flights, Alan Shepard's 15-minute arc in May, Gus Grissom's 16-minute repeat in July, that the Soviet state media dismissed, not entirely inaccurately, as hops. The gap between a hop and an orbit was not merely technical, it was civilizational. It was the gap between 2 visions of the future, and the entire world was watching to see which one would get there first. If Glenn's capsule burned on reentry, if the math was wrong, if the angle was off, if the retro rockets fired a fraction of a second late, it would not be reported simply as a tragedy. It would be reported as proof. Proof that American science, American technology, American civilization itself wasn't equal to the task. The Cold War was being fought with trajectory calculations and orbital mechanics as surely as with nuclear warheads. The stakes on Pad 14 that morning were not one man's life. They were the credibility of an entire way of organizing the world. Katherine Coleman, Goebel Johnson, was 43 years old, and almost nothing about her story had been easy. She had enrolled at West Virginia State College at 15, not because she was being pushed, but because the mathematics available to her in high school had simply run out. She graduated summa cum laude at 18, with degrees in mathematics and French, which is the kind of sentence that reads easily and lands very quietly, when in fact it should land like a stone dropped from a great height. When West Virginia University desegregated its graduate program in 1939, she was one of 3 black students personally selected by the university president to integrate the institution. She left after 1 year, not because she failed, but because she got married and started a family, which was what women did, which was what was expected, which was the silent wall that didn't need to be built out of stone, because it had already been built out of assumption. She came to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in 1953 and was assigned to the West Area Computing Section, the pool of black women mathematicians who worked in a building separate from their white counterparts, who used separate bathrooms, separate dining facilities, separate everything, and who nonetheless produced work that the white male engineers in the main building could not do without. Within a year, Katherine had walked herself into a briefing she hadn't been invited to, sat down, and started asking questions. When someone pointed out that women didn't attend those meetings, she asked, with genuine and weaponized curiosity, where exactly that rule was written down. Nobody could find it. She kept attending. She had co-authored a research report on orbital mechanics under her own name, becoming one of the first women at the agency to receive that public credit. On her desk, next to the Frieden calculating machine and the stacks of yellow engineering paper, she kept a small framed photograph. Not of rockets, not of equations, of her 3 daughters. The IBM 7090 had arrived at Langley the previous year and had been received with the mixture of reverence and barely concealed anxiety that powerful new things always produce. It occupied an entire room. It required its own dedicated air conditioning system to prevent its vacuum tubes from overheating. It could perform 24,000 multiplications per second, a figure that in 1961 seemed less like an engineering specification and more like a philosophical statement about the nature of human thought and whether machines would eventually replace it entirely. Most of the engineers trusted it completely. You trust things you don't fully understand in proportion to how much authority they project, and the IBM 7090 projected an enormous amount of authority. John Glenn did not. Glenn was 39 years old, a Marine colonel with 249 combat missions, logged across 2 separate wars, a man who had set the transcontinental speed record in 1957 and who processed danger the way other people process weather, as a fact of the environment, relevant but not alarming. He had reviewed the IBM's trajectory calculations for his mission, and he had made a decision that was, depending on your perspective, either the most rational thing an astronaut had ever done or the most human. He would not fly. He was clear about this. Unmovable in the way that very calm people are unmovable, until a human mathematician had checked every number the machine had produced. He asked for Katherine specifically. The exact phrase, as it has been recorded and repeated, was, "Get the girl to check the numbers." He meant it as the highest compliment available to him in the language he had. She was, in his mind, the standard. The machine was the variable. If the girl said the numbers were right, the numbers were right. If the girl found a problem, there was a problem. Katherine had been working through the verification since the previous afternoon. The specific mathematical problem was this. Glenn's mission profile called for 3 complete orbits of Earth at an altitude of approximately 160 miles, traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. The total flight time would be just under 5 hours. At the end of the 3rd orbit, the retro rockets mounted on the heat shield of Friendship 7 would fire in sequence, slowing the capsule enough for Earth's gravity to begin pulling it back down. The reentry corridor, the narrow band of angle and velocity within which a capsule could successfully slow down without either burning up or skipping back into permanent orbit, was measured in fractions of a degree. The IBM had calculated the parameters of that corridor using a mathematical model of Earth's gravitational field. And here was the problem that wasn't a problem until you looked closely enough. Earth is not a perfect sphere. Its equatorial regions bulge slightly outward due to the planet's rotation, which means gravitational pull varies in small but real ways depending on where in its orbit the capsule happens to be. Across one orbit, this variation is negligible. Across 3 orbits, small errors compound. The IBM had modeled this variation one way. Katherine's equations modeled it differently. Her figure for the re-entry window differed from the machine's figure by an amount that was small in absolute terms and potentially catastrophic in operational ones. She checked it a 2nd time. She checked it a 3rd time. And she was not a person who second-guessed herself. Second-guessing yourself in mathematics is a form of sentimentality. But she was a person who understood that the only thing worse than finding an error was finding it after someone had already acted on the wrong number. Her calculation stood. She reported it up the chain. Inside Friendship 7, John Glenn had been lying on his back since approximately 5 in the morning, sealed inside a capsule roughly the size of a phone booth, wearing a pressure suit with 120 separate layers of material that had been assembled largely by hand over many months by seamstresses in Massachusetts. The white room at the top of the gantry, the sealed, pressurized chamber through which astronauts boarded, had smelled of rubber and machine oil and the sharp, clean bite of pure oxygen. The technicians who secured his harness and sealed his hatch wore white coveralls and moved with the careful, precise deliberateness of people who are aware that they are part of history and would very much prefer to be part of the good kind. There had been delays. There were always delays. A weather hold, a technical issue with a fuel valve that took 90 minutes to diagnose and clear. Glenn lay in the dark of his capsule and did what he always did during holds. He ran through the checklist, again and again. Not because he had forgotten anything, Glenn forgot nothing, but because the checklist was a structure, and structure in an uncontrolled situation is a form of sanity. He did not know in those hours of waiting that 40 miles away, a woman was at a desk running a pencil down a column of numbers that bore his life inside them. He had asked for the check. He trusted the check would happen. Whether or not he thought about it specifically in those hours is not recorded. What is recorded is that when the check came back clean, when the word came through the communication chain that the human mathematician had verified the trajectory and confirmed the re-entry window, Glenn said he was ready. He had always been ready. But now the math was ready too. At 9:47 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, the Atlas rocket's kerosene and liquid oxygen engines ignited at the base of Pad 14. The sound, a physical and percussive thing that was less a noise than a pressure change in the air itself, reached the observers clustered 3 miles away, approximately 4 seconds after the light. The rocket rose through its own exhaust cloud, a column of brilliant white steam against the deep blue of the Florida morning sky, climbing with a slowness that always surprises people watching for the first time, as if gravity is making one final argument before conceding the point. Glenn's voice came over the loop, steady as a man discussing the weather. "Oh, the view is tremendous." The capsule crossed the Atlantic. It crossed Africa. It crossed the Indian Ocean. The tracking stations at Bermuda and the Canary Islands and Kano and Zanzibar and Muchea and Woomera in Australia passed it from one to the next, like something precious being handed down a very long line of careful hands. At Mission Control in Cape Canaveral, the flight controllers sat at their consoles under the dim fluorescent ceiling, their white shirts luminous in the monitor glow, their ties loosened by the third orbit, their ashtrays accumulating evidence of how the hours had passed. The green phosphor displays tracked the capsule's position as a simple, bright point moving across a flat projection of the globe, the most consequential dot in the world, described in 17 numbers, that had to stay within their specified ranges, or everything ended. They stayed within range. They stayed within range because the math was right. The math was right because Katherine Johnson had checked it. 4 hours and 55 minutes after launch, Friendship 7's heat shield hit the upper atmosphere at 17,000 miles per hour. The temperature at the leading edge reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The capsule went temporarily radio silent. The plasma of re-entry ionizes the air around the vehicle and blocks all communication for approximately 4.5 minutes. 4.5 minutes, during which Mission Control could do nothing but wait and count and not say out loud what everyone was thinking. Then Glenn's voice came back through the static, composed and slightly amused, describing the view through his window as the drogue chute deployed. He hit the water 312 miles southeast of Grand Turk Island. The recovery ship Noah reached him 21 minutes after splashdown. He climbed out of the hatch into the Atlantic sunlight, red-faced from the heat, grinning with his whole face, and shook hands with the sailors who hauled him aboard. In Hampton, Virginia, the fluorescent lights were still humming. The paper cup of cold coffee had been thrown away. Katherine Johnson was already working on something else. She would go on to calculate the trajectory for Apollo 11, the flight that actually put human beings on the surface of the moon. She would compute the emergency return procedures that helped bring the crew of Apollo 13 safely back to Earth after their oxygen tank exploded 205,000 miles from home in April of 1970. A crisis for which her backup calculations, prepared well in advance, turned out to be exactly what the mission needed. She would work at NASA for 33 years total before retiring in 1986. In 2015, at the age of 97, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The citation used the word pioneering. It was accurate, but insufficient. Pioneering suggests someone walking into unknown territory. Katherine Johnson walked into known territory and refused to accept the signs that said she didn't belong there. That is a different thing, and in many ways, a harder one. We remember the rockets. We have the photographs, the great columns of white exhaust against the Florida sky, the capsules floating in the ocean, the parades down Broadway with ticker tape falling like paper snow. What we do not have photographs of is a woman in Hampton, Virginia, at 6:45 in the morning, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow, a pencil in her hand, checking the numbers that made all those other photographs possible. The history of exploration is always, in the end, the history of the people the official record forgot to include. Katherine Johnson was not forgotten exactly. Forgetting implies you once remembered. She was simply never listed in the first place. Her name was not in the headline the morning of February 21st. The headline said, "Glenn orbits Earth 3 times," which was true, which was also incomplete in a way that matters. Because here is the question that February morning keeps asking, across all the decades between that desk in Hampton and wherever you are sitting right now. How many other names are missing? How many other cold cups of coffee? How many other pencils? How many other columns of numbers that no one photographed, that no one headlined, that no one remembered to remember? How many of those are holding up the history we think we know? What do you think we're still getting wrong about who actually makes the future happen? If that question stays with you, if it should, subscribe. Because that's exactly the kind of history we're here to dig into, one morning at a time.
Oh, before you go, if this video made sense to you, subscribe to the channel. This helps YouTube deliver this content to even more people. Also, leave your like. It's essential for our growth here on the platform. And if you want to support us even more, Super Thanks is right below and helps directly with the production of new content. Comment here where you're from. And thank you for watching us until the end. See you in the next video.